The Cleveland torso murderer case has to be one of the most insanely violent and also scary cold cases out there right this minute. And the fact that it is a cold case still can be quite disturbing to some. And on today's episode of The Twitch, we're going to be looking at the facts, evidence, and trying to find some sort of piece together ending for this nearly 90-year case. As always with the Twitch, we start out with the victims so that we can get a baseline of who was affected with these killings, and then we'll get into the story to explain what happened. Although the official body count for these murders is 12, it's suspected that even though this was released and there is evidence behind it, that there could be as much as 20 bodies out there that were related to this one killer. Not because they're tied to evidence, but because they have similar deaths and have similar attributions to this killer. Okay, so we're going to start out with victim number 1. We're starting out with Andrew Andrassy. He was found September 23rd, 1935, and he was found near the Jackass Hill area of Hillsbury Run. Andrassy was found about 30 feet away from John Doe 1, who was another victim, which we'll get into. He was decapitated and emasculated, and his head was thankfully found later on. He was estimated to have died about 2 to 3 days before the authorities discovered him. Next is Florence Genevieve Pololio, and she was found on February 7th, 1936. She was found between 2315 and 2335 East 20th Street in downtown Cleveland. When they found her, her body had been completely dismembered, and on top of that, her head was never recovered. And also by the time they had discovered her, she had probably been dead for 2 to 4 days. Next we have Jane Doe 1. She was found February 23rd, 1937. She was found by the Euclid Beach and Lake Erie shore. When they found her, she was so chopped up and mangled that they couldn't even identify her, and she was in the same spot as a supposed victim from 1934. Dubbed the Lady of the Lake, there are some suspects out there that they, like I said, believed were a part of this case, but were never officially put into the file, and because of lack of evidence, never could be put into the file. Which it's very interesting that she was found in the same spot as one of these supposed killings. Next we have Jane Doe number 2. She was found June 6, 1937. She was the only black victim and was found missing a rib and, of course, decapitated. But again, thankfully, the head was recovered. Next we have Jane Doe number 3. Like I said, there was a lot of victims. Now, it took a long time for them to find the entire person because she was split up. On April the 8th, the victim's lower leg was discovered, of course, by itself. On May the 2nd, a thigh was discovered floating in a river next to a burlap bag. And inside the bag was nothing good. There was a chopped up torso, the other thigh, and a left foot. The rest of the body and the head was never found. But the victim was said to have drugs in their system, which is interesting, but then again, still not enough evidence to make any sort of theory that they could have pinned on anyone. Next, sadly, Jane Doe number 4. These bodies were so dismembered and cut up that they really could never define who they were at all, which is really sad because these people who lived lives died and they will never be remembered in history. Her death was kind of plain and simple. They found her body decapitated and then they found her head later on. So I'm not sure if it was just a fact that they didn't want to release her actual name to the public, or it was a matter of somehow they really could not identify her. Okay, let's try to get through these Next, we have John Doe, number 2, also nicknamed the Tattooed Man. He was decapitated while alive, and his head was recovered. Next, we have John Doe, number 3. He was dismembered while still alive, and his head was never recovered, and this was also the only West Side victim of the entire batch. Next, we have John Doe, number 4. The body was dismembered below the hips, and no other body parts were discovered, not even the head. Like I said, these bodies were so badly cut up and damaged and just dismembered that you literally could not tell that it was a human. And finally, John Doe, number 5. He was sadly, again, decapitated, but the head was, again, never found. Possible victims include the Lady of the Lake that was killed in 1934. Like I said before, she was related to victim number 7 because victim number 7 was found in the same spot. But the Lady of the Lake was definitely not a future killing and was labeled as victim 1, or as most widely known, victim 0. I feel like this might have been kind of a test subject of how the public and the police would go crazy over finding a body like this. Now, clearly they didn't suspect anything and didn't launch into a full investigation like they did with the other killings, but it is interesting that that victim number 7 winded up in the same spot, which again makes me think that they were killed by the same person because that was a test subject, and they found that maybe that place was a good spot to dump a body, so they used it again for victim number 7. It's just very interesting. But there are a lot of possible victims. Thankfully, these victims were identified, but again, they were either decapitated or their torso was ripped up. There was just a lot of connections, but there was also a lot of possible victims. So I'm not going to get into them all, but then again, all the links to all the sites that I've used are going to be in the description, so you guys can do a little bit of investigating on your own. Now that we have the entire batch of victims talked about, flushed out, and kind of descripted, let's get into the story. Now, whoever was killing these people definitely had a type. Everyone that was identified was either lower class or just plain out broke. All of them really had nowhere to live besides just very rundown apartments or on the street. Another thing is that a lot of these victims were found floating near water or by water. So I'm not sure if this is his type of killing or he just prefers water because the bodies can be flushed away along with a lot of top level evidence. The murderer also always, of course, decapitated or dismembered all of his victims. And sadly, usually the cause of death that was determined by the autopsy was dismemberment or decapitation, which is really sad. But then again, when you think about it, it might be better to go that way than be tortured or anything else by these people. Now, the one woman did have drugs in her system, so was she doing recreational drugs and then was kidnapped or was drawn to a location in which she was killed, or was she pumped with drugs and then killed? You also have to remember, this were a time where scanning fingerprints and looking up your file on a computer was not a thing. This is the 1930s, and people weren't exactly tech savvy. Tech really didn't exist. So it was really hard to identify these victims because they didn't have any sort of file system on the online or any sort of backstory on these people, because it was very primitive stuff that they were doing to identify victims. And when victims are decapitated and completely dismembered and thrown into burlap bags, it's kind of hard to find out if she's your neighbor. Another thing to point out is that most of all the male victims were castrated. Now, if this is again a serial killer thing where this is their type, or if this was done to them, that's completely different. Elliot Ness was one of the biggest officials working on this case, and when you talk about this case, you're definitely going to bring him up. He was really one of the main drivers for this case. He really went to all the evidence. He even went to abandoned buildings, dumping over bodies of homeless people and trying to find this killer, trying to find any shred of evidence. And he was very determined to have some sort of closure for this case. but it was, of course, never discovered. Ness even went as far in this case that the killer themselves taunted him by leaving the shredded up bodies of two of his victims in plain sight of his office. Now, we have the story, we have the victim, so we have everything in place, so I think it's appropriate that we look at the suspects. One of the biggest suspects for the case was Dr. Francis Sweeney. Now, he was very suspicious because there was a lot of evidence surrounding his alibi. There was a lot of evidence surrounding everything about him. But then again, the case was never closed, so clearly something went wrong. But what? This is where it gets interesting. Born May 5th, 1894, Sweeney was a World War I veteran, and he was in a medical unit who, get this, specialized in amputees. So in the field, he would be the one that would have to cut off your leg because you got shot. What happened with these victims? Dismembered, heads cut off, thighs cut off, fingers cut off, everything dismembered. And here's this guy, a World War I veteran, who his job was to dismember your leg or your arm. Now, it's very sad that they could never pin it on this guy, because this was 110% him. He specialized in cutting off these guys' legs and arms in the field. He knew how to do it surgically. Get this, Elliot Ness, the man, Elliot Ness, he, of course, oversaw everything about this case and interviewed Sweeney in person, and he interrogated him. And while investigating, of course, they had a polygraph test that was available in the police's arsenal. That was a thing back then. And when Sweeney took the polygraph test, it is officially stated in Elliot's files and journals and everything that he failed the polygraph test twice. Now, this seems like evidence enough, but they just had to get a teeny bit more to pin him. They didn't have DNA, they didn't have incriminating photos, they didn't have anything of that sort, they didn't have eyewitness reports. So he just needed a teeny bit more to actually keep him in the station, right? But here's the problem. A good friend of Sweeney's was one of Elliot's political rivals. And this dude had a lot of money, publicly humiliated Elliot because he never could find the killer. After a while of interrogations and everything, they literally legally could not keep Sweeney in the police station anymore, and they had to let him go. No further evidence came out, and they really could never solve the mystery. And Sweeney later died in a veteran hospital on July 9th, 1964. Now, another theory is that this was never committed by one person. All the autopsy reports were, of course, inconclusive. They couldn't gather too much evidence around how they were actually killed, like if it was by this certain tool or if it was by one person. Now, because these results were inconclusive, and because some evidence did not tie to Sweeney, like specific dates or specific times where he was at a specific location when these murders were said to happen, but it is a theory nonetheless that there was more than one Cleveland torso murderer. And through it all, the really only hard evidence is that they were killed. There was no specific evidence tying it to Sweeney. There was no explicit evidence that they were killed by one person. There was no explicit evidence that they were killed by many people. There was no explicit evidence that they were killed by a man or a specific woman. There was no hard evidence about anything besides the fact that they were killed. And I think that's one of the most eerie things to this day, that they were so close and there was so much evidence and theories going around. They were so close to getting someone actually that was a suspect, that was an official suspect that they could keep, yet really there was no hard evidence around anything. This is one of the most interesting cases that I've covered, and it really intrigues me that this guy put so much effort into it and even was taunted by the killer only to not discover it. It just feels like he put all his life work into it and never really got the answer he was looking for. And that's really sad, and that's a terrible way to end the story, but it is the end nonetheless. So I'm sticking to my theory. There were a few other suspects, but I looked over them, and they really just didn't fit. They didn't fit so much that these suspects would have been held over a day at the precinct. So they didn't see, the people who actually worked on the case didn't see him as a fit, and neither did I. I really do think that Sweeney did it. And I feel like his political friends and just a lot of power surrounding him really got him out of the situation as quick as possible. And could those friends have been helping him out? 100%. Remember, there was no evidence tying one person to these murders. So could have his political friends and rich friends helped him carry out these murders? 100%. But we'll never know. Thank you guys for watching this video. The support on the channel has been absolutely insane. We went from 43 subscribers 2 days ago, or as I post this, it's probably going to be 3 days ago, to 57 as I post this. So, like, my mind is just blown. I was crying earlier. It's like, the amount of support on the channel has been absolutely insane. So thank you guys for sticking around and, sticking around my channel and subscribing and liking all that sort of stuff. I love you guys. You guys are the best. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.